Welcome back. With this lecture, we're going to continue really the debates that were taking place in the 4th century that led up to the Second Council of Nicaea in 381. And then we're going to take the debates a little bit past that, heading toward the Council at Chalcedon in 451 AD. Now, this particular lecture is going to deal with the problems, the heresies that had to be addressed both at first the council in Constantinople in 381 AD, and then the heresies that had to be addressed at the council at Chalcedon in 451 AD. There's a lot of activity that goes on during those years that we don't really have time to deal with in detail. But I wanted to make sure that you understand at the outset here that the next set of PowerPoints, the PowerPoint number 13, will not have a video. Those are, as before with the Council at Nicaea, a set of PowerPoint notes that you should look over and be familiar with in order to understand what happened at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. But really, this lecture is leading up to that, and I'll expect you to read those PowerPoint slides for the next lecture without video in order to carry forth the debate after that. But again, this particular lecture, I should say, is actually going to take us up to the Council at Chalcedon in 451 AD. So let me go ahead and begin, and there's a bit of a transition here as we get started. We've already seen the debates over Arianism, parts 1 and part 2, phase 2, and really what we're going to be looking at here is kind of like a follow-up to that. So with the adoption of the Nicene Creed in 325, we saw that it didn't really solve the Arian problem completely, and the debates kept going. And again, as I said a moment ago, there are a lot more debates, and there were a number of minor councils, and the debate went back and forth, some accepting the Nicene Creed and therefore rejecting Arian doctrine, and some that were still accepting of Arian doctrine, and we're still debating the Nicene Creed of 325. Well, that went on until, again, the Council of Nicaea in 381, and so this is really sort of a catch-up lecture to that time, to that particular council. The debates about the person of Christ started to become more to the fore. So those were Trinitarian debates. These are not going to be debates that are more about the person of Christ, as we will see we get going here. The first one of the heresies that had to be addressed after the Council of 325, Nicaea of 325, was the heresy of Apollinarianism. Apollinarianism is named after, obviously enough, a fellow named Apollinarius. He actually started out as an ally of Athanasius, and he was one of the people that at the very first seemed to be a supporter of the Nicene Creed of 325. He was born and lived his whole life in Laodicea, and that's not the same one referred to in Revelation chapter 3, a different city. This was a city that was further east. It was over in Syria, what's modern-day Syria, just southwest of Antioch. As a young churchman, he had some ups and downs, but later was noted for his unusual ability and gracious saintliness. So he was even one of the staunchest opponents who paid tribute. One of his staunchest opponents paid tribute to his sterling character. So this is something we need to keep in mind, that even people who were judged later to be heretical weren't necessarily bad people. The Nicene congregation of Laodicea selected him as bishop. That is a congregation that adhered to the Nicene Creed of 325. Somewhere around, they appointed him as the bishop somewhere around 361. Evidence would suggest that Apollinaris put more time into teaching and writing in nearby Antioch than into his ecclesiastical administration, and that can be a problem if you're not spending time with the people. You might not be maybe a good preacher, but you might not be the best sort of pastor. In any case, he was a revered teacher, and as I've already said, he was a friend of those that were the defenders of the Nicene Creed of 325, principally even of Athanasius. And he had a regular correspondence. He wrote back and forth to Basil the Great. We've introduced him along with the other so-called Cappadocians. And he even numbered Jerome, Jerome, who was the translator of the Latin Vulgate later on, actually studied under Apollinaris for a while. It was really as the bishop of Laodicea that he made his reputation. So what did Apollinaris believe? Apollinaris was, again, as I said, a staunch opponent of Arianism, so much so that unfortunately he sort of swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. He had emphasized the deity of Christ so much that he really kind of ended up denying his true humanity. Apollinaris taught that the incarnation was the union of the divine spirit of the Son with human flesh taken from the womb of the Virgin Mary. Now, that sounds a little funny, but isn't terribly wrong if you understand that indeed Christ had a true human nature. But this is exactly the thing that Apollinaris was questioning. So the Son didn't enter an already existing man, as the adoptionists had claimed. We've seen them before. Nor did he unite with flesh on the basis such that he too was a creature, so he was not saying, he denied what the Arians were saying. Instead, he said, the divine Logos became a man taking on human flesh. However, Apollinaris taught that Jesus did not have a human mind or will. He said this because he thought that the Logos didn't really need another mind or another will. He already had the divine equivalence already. So when he took on human flesh, he already had a mind, he already had a will. So from Apollinaris' point of view, the humanity of Christ consisted only of his body, his flesh and bones. And everything that the Logos had lacked before the incarnation is what he took on in his incarnation. So just as ordinary human beings are compounded of body and soul, so Jesus was compounded of flesh and Logos into a single unified whole. Apollinaris called this union of his nature, physis, because if one part were to be removed, there would be no man, Christ Jesus, left. So the only thing that, again, Christ took, according to Apollinaris, was this human body. So, to draw that out a little bit further, there are two assumptions that we must understand about Apollinaris before getting into what he contributed to the debate. First, concerning his human nature, Apollinaris, being influenced by Plato, understood human nature to be composed of three aspects: a body, a sensitive soul, and a rational mind. Apollinaris would argue that the Bible teaches that the same concept used of the language of the body, soul, and spirit in 1 Thessalonians 5:23 helps us understand what was going on in the incarnation. For Apollinaris, the body and soul made up the lower part of the nature of life force, and the rational intellectual mind was identified as the higher nature, known as the mind or consciousness. Concerning the divine nature, Apollinaris emphasized the teaching that God does not change and cannot suffer. The technical term for not changing is immutable, and the technical term for not suffering is impassible. He is impassible. He doesn't have passion, and is all-knowing, that is, omniscient. He considered it blasphemous to suggest that God could be made into a weak and limited human being susceptible to any kind of suffering. God had no beginning, and it is not about to begin something new in his nature at any point in history, so Christ must possess all the divine traits from the beginning. And Apollinaris argued that if that's the case, then he didn't need any of the corresponding human traits of any sort of nature of mind or the soul. So with these two presuppositions, the question then was, into what kind of flesh can God be made? Apollinaris answered that Jesus Christ took on humanity only to the extent of assuming a human body and a sensitive soul. Again, that's the lower part. That's the more physical part of the immaterial part of human beings, so to speak. But that's all he took. The Logos, the eternal Son, replaced the rational intellectual soul, or the higher part of humanity that would have existed in a normal human person, which meant that the person of Jesus Christ lacked that piece, that important piece of human nature. In other words, his mind, what he thought, what he willed, even his emotions were not human. They were just things that weren't necessary if all of that existed already in the Logos that took upon the human flesh. Well, who were Apollinaris's orthodox opponents? Well, all three of the Cappadocians, who we've already been introduced to, opposed Apollinaris. All three of them wrote against him. But principally, Gregory of Nazianzus, or also known as Gregory the Theologian, was the primary defender of Nicene orthodoxy against Apollinaris. In one particular letter that he wrote to another bishop, Cledonius, Gregory addresses the doctrine of Apollinaris this way. And by the way, let me go back. You can see that throughout these slides, I have spelled Apollinaris or Apollinaris two different ways. Both are correct. It just depends on what source you're using. So Apollinaris or Apollinaris, Neris, both are correct. Edward R. Hardy summarizes the main thrust of this letter. He said it contains the clear statement of the essential doctrine of the full humanity of Christ. So that's what Gregory of Nazianzus is defending. Gregory coins a very famous maxim: whatever is not assumed is unhealed. And what he explained was this: if it was half of Adam that fell, then half might be assumed and saved. That if it was only his physical body that fell, then there might be a point to Apollinaris's doctrine that all the Logos would have needed to assume is a body. But, back to the quote, if it was the whole of Adam that fell, it is united to the whole of him who was begotten and contains complete salvation. That is, the person of the Son, or the Logos, was united to a complete human being, not only of a physical body, not only of a sort of, again, that sensitive soul idea, but to a full human nature of human mind, human heart, and human will. Again, in Apollinaris' view, in the person of Christ, the place of the nous, or mind, is occupied by the divine Logos. Thus, the humanity of Christ is in effect limited to his body. In turn, in opposition to this docetic view, we've seen that word docetic, docetism, before. Again, that just means he seemed to be human but wasn't. So Apollinaris' doctrine is like those other views in this sense, that he didn't really have a human nature. In opposition to this view of the incarnate Christ, Gregory argued Christ must have had both a rational soul and a true human body. Not just a sensitive soul, but a rational soul. He means he had a mind and a heart and a will that was fully human. For that which has not assumed, Christ has not assumed, is not healed. So if it's just a matter of healing the fallen human body and saving us physically, maybe assuming a human body would have been enough. But Gregory makes it clear that Christ saves us, and we are, again, a body, a soul, and a heart, and a mind, and a will, and all of those things. And Christ assumed a genuine human body, genuine human mind and heart in order that we might be healed in our mind and heart. And of course, body too, because we believe in a bodily resurrection ultimately. In effect, if Christ did not have a fully human mind, he wasn't human. He couldn't be a second Adam, and he couldn't redeem. Only a Christ who took on the whole of man could redeem what was wrong with man, mind, heart, and body. To strengthen his argument, Gregory discussed Christ's role as the second Adam. He said, if anyone has put his trust in him as a man without a human mind, he is really bereft of mind, quite unworthy of salvation. That's a very flowery way of a very caustic sort of statement. In other words, if you don't believe that he died to save your mind as well as your body, then you're probably not saved. For that which he has not assumed, he has not healed, going on to quote Gregory again. But that which is united to his Godhead is also saved. Again, if only half of Adam fell, that which Christ assumes and saves would be half. But if the whole of his nature fell, it must be united to the whole nature of him who was begotten, and so be saved as a whole. In other words, if all of Adam was lost and ruined by the fall, and that's what was lost, he died physically, but Adam also was one who was dead in his trespasses and sinned, one who had a fallen human mind, a fallen human will, and that fallenness had to be redeemed. Then if Christ, the second Adam, must put on all that Adam possessed in order to restore human nature and live the life that Adam failed to live, not just bodily, but also, again, in his mind and will. Well, as I said at the outset of this part of the lecture, Apollinaris' views were rejected at the Council of Constantinople in 381, and we've already seen in a previous lecture that was the council that refined and clarified exactly what the Nicene Creed of 325 was trying to say, and that is Christ is fully God, and also at now we see at the Council of Constantinople, that in 381 it was affirmed that he was fully man as well. Well, that's the Nicene Creed, and that's the final version that we have of that in our the way we normally see the Nicene Creed or read about it. Well, we're going to stop this particular part of the lecture. This will be loaded up as a separate lecture, and we will pick it up in moving forward to the heresies that led up to the Council of Chalcedon in 451.